So good morning, everyone. So let's get into this, and let me put it into proper perspective. So Jesus has already entered into Jerusalem. He's already walked in. He already knows that this is his final trip into Jerusalem. Indeed, according to Luke's gospel, a week from now, he is put to death. He has a lot of enemies, scribes, Pharisees. Both of them dislike him incredibly. There's also the chief priest, there's a priest of the temple, but basically the scribes and the Pharisees have a lot of antagonistic experiences with Jesus. I think one of the reasons why 2 weeks ago we heard in Luke's gospel about the fact that the man who walked in and looked at the tax collector and said, "At least I'm not a wretch like him." You remember what he was? He was a Sadducee. And I think it's because Jesus wasn't really too keen about these people, because they kept pushing and prodding him to sort of get him to stumble along the way. They wanted him taken care of. They wanted him taken away. They wanted him put to death. See, the problem is when you have a preacher who comes in who has more authority and gathers more crowds than they do as Sadducees, of course, then there is this huge problem about being jealous, right? So now all of a sudden, Jesus is drawing these huge crowds, are all listening to him. So they try, the scribes and the Pharisees both, they try to back Jesus into a corner. Now, the thing that's really hypocritical about all of this is the fact that the Sadducees don't believe in the resurrection of the dead anyway. They just don't believe it is going to happen. They don't believe it's going to take place. They read the scriptures in a very certain way. This is an important part to watch. That here we have these individuals who for 2,000 years have been sort of looking at, reading, analyzing, and interpreting Moses, and in that they come up with the determination that there is no resurrection from the dead. The Pharisees, however, on the other side, look at the very same scriptures, look at the very same Torah, and they make a determination that there is the resurrection of the dead. So they come up to him absolutely hypocritical, and they cry out and they say, "Hey, so here's this story. Now there's this guy, he dies, next brother, next brother, next brother, next brother." And they're absolutely right, because according to the Jewish scriptures, this is what you do. The reason you do this, one, is for the sake of lineage. You want your family name to be handed down generation after generation. Indeed, if you look at our family, Arthur, our son, is named Arthur, not Eric. Eric's his middle name. I got that in. But the first part was really Arthur, and the reason for that was in honor of my dad. See, my older brother, 10 years older, didn't have any kids. He had a couple of dogs, but no kids. And so in the midst of all that, my father's name would have been lost if we did not give it to my son Arthur. Now, just so you know, Elizabeth Victoria was going to be the name if we had a girl, all right? So we did prep for both, okay? We weren't vying on one side or the other. I wasn't lighting candles hoping for a son. I wasn't pulling any strings with anybody. No, it was okay. Whatever happened, happened. Anyway, so Arthur bears the name Arthur EricJHall because, for me, I wanted my father honored and to be carried on, if you will, and perhaps Arthur will have a son and he will name him whatever. But for us, that was something that we were determination. It's the very same in Mosaic law that you want the name, the generation, to be handed down time after time, generation after generation. But there's another problem here that Moses is very keenly aware of. If the husband dies without any children, the woman becomes a widow. By becoming a widow, she drops to a very low place in the social status of their day. Nobody cares for them. She's all the way on the bottom, and according to the law of Moses, the temple is supposed to be the ones who are providing for the widows. So I think Moses, in his wisdom, realized that if we did not allow for this woman to be married by the brothers And actually, the way it's written in Leviticus is that the brother should marry the wife of his brother who died. And all of that, I think, is for the betterment and the good intention of watching out for the widow, because otherwise she would be left to fend for herself. And if no one took pity on her or cared for her, then we would have an issue where she would be, sort of left. So anyway, believe it or not, there happens to be 7 brothers. So this poor woman goes down this whole generation of all 7, and I just think it's kind of funny, and I'm sure Luke didn't write it this way, but it says, in the Greek, finally she died. And I was thinking, after 7 brothers, okay, look, it's probably time to get a rest, right? It's just what it is. Not to mention all the 7 personalities and all that. The story goes on and on. So they says, so she dies and she ends up in heaven, and then the Sadducees say, whose wife will she be? I want to stop here a minute, because this is the biggest of the hypocrisies that no one talks about. If a woman is barren, according to their culture and their traditions, it means that she is not blessed by God to bear a child. So understand, the Sadducees are saying that the woman who is not blessed by God because she is not fertile and she can't bring forth a child actually ends up in heaven anyway. You get that? Everyone in the audience hearing this, not only the fact that there are 7 brothers, generation after generation, but the fact that the Sadducees go as far to say that this woman, who is actually not blessed by God because she hasn't been able to conceive and bear a child, that this child, who the entire culture and religious community would have distanced themselves from, because she would have been seen as having now suffering from her own sins or the sins of her family, that this woman now, who is on the outside of their religious society culture, actually ends up in heaven anyway. And that is the biggest of the hypocrisies that the Sadducees throw forth. All of this simply to try to catch Jesus in some sort of a political, religious argument and back him into a corner, so he has to make a determination about which brother she would belong to at the resurrection, which, by the way, they don't believe in anyway. And so Jesus says, in this world, people are married and given in marriage, but in the world to come, that is not the reality. Notice that Jesus never denies or pushes back on the fact that the woman ends up in heaven. You and I, in our everyday life, we are very busy in the here and now. We're very busy in the daily activities and responsibilities that we have. I would say we're not busy, I would say we're overwhelmed. And very often, simply trying to break away for a Sunday service, or to get away even with God, not even about going to church, just reflecting upon what happens next. We're not really comfortable doing that, or we're not forced to do that until there is such a time that there is a death in our family. And then there's a death in the family. For all the hundreds, if not thousands, of funerals that I have done, every single person is sitting there asking themselves, what's next? What happens next? Because all they see is the body. All they see is the body in a casket. And that is devastating and painful. But it forces you to ask yourself, what is it that we believe? See, this story is important in Luke because a week from now, Jesus is crucified in Luke's gospel and he raises from the dead. So let's talk about that a little bit, because I don't know how you talk about this without talking about Jesus' resurrection. History has a wide array of stories about different individuals, different cultures, different traditions, all of which talk about someone somewhere who has, in some way, shape, or form, reappeared after their death. And a lot of leaders of cults and religions have done this. The distinction here about Jesus actually goes back to Mark's gospel. Do you remember what happens when Jesus enters the room with the disciples in Mark's gospel? What he asks for, what Jesus specifically asks for? He asks for a piece of fish. And the reason he asks for a piece of fish is to show that he is not a ghost. He physically eats fish so that everyone would understand, I'm not a ghost. I have truly risen from the dead. And if you look, all the Gospels talk about his resurrection. And if you take a look, there are thousands upon thousands who are put to death because they cannot deny their experience of seeing this Jesus crucified, risen from the dead. And when they are told, you can save your life, all you have to do is deny the fact that you saw this Jesus and that Jesus truly did die and is still in a tomb, or the disciples stole the body. If you come out and you say that, your life is spared. You can go home. And they don't. Thousands upon thousands upon thousands cannot deny what they have experienced and what they have seen. Indeed, our faith is set upon the faith of those individuals who encounter Jesus in a very real way. But let's take it a step forward. Jesus ends up ascending into heaven, and after the ascension, the most powerful story we know, it happens to do with Saul, who becomes Paul, who's riding on a horse and literally gets knocked off of his horse, which, quite frankly, I think probably most of us could use from time to time, is to get knocked off of our horse. And then ultimately, he asks the bright light shining person in front of him, who are you? And Jesus says, I am the one you are persecuting. I am Jesus of Nazareth. And Paul has his conversion experience. The entire early church has no scriptures. Think about this. There are no scriptures. There are no sacraments. There are no institutions. There are no dividing points between believers or unbelievers. It's just all the believers are simply believers. In fact, if you go to Israel and you talk to any of the tour guides like we did when we were there, the early Christians were not called Christians, they were called believers. That was the distinction that made them different than everyone else, is that they were simply believers. And why were they believers? Because it wasn't about they were told to know this, you had to memorize this, you had to attend this. None of that. What was it all about? It was simply all about they had a personal encounter with this resurrected Jesus. And that encounter could not be denied. And so for hundreds of years, the church never existed in the formulary that we see now. We never gathered in places like this. We gathered in the catacombs. And why did we gather in the catacombs? First of all, it is the place where those who had believed in Jesus were put to death and ultimately buried. And also, we were put there because the scribes and the Pharisees and the people from the temple could not go into the catacombs because they would become unclean and defiled. And the other reason, the last reason, the Romans were afraid of ghosts. Absolutely true. So the reason why the early Christians found comfort and knew that they weren't going to be pursued into where they laid dead bodies was because of all of those reasons they were safe. But they gathered as a community, and they did and they do exactly what we do now. They tell stories about Jesus, what he did, how he was. They talked about his authenticity of his message, that what he spoke and what he did and how he died are very clear examples of the integrity of who this man is, but ultimately it is his resurrection that is the linchpin to everything else. So Jesus is talking to the Sadducees here, talking about resurrection, and he's saying at the resurrection, there are no more married and not being married. Jesus is talking about all this, probably fully aware of the fact that his death is imminent, but that ultimately God will be glorified in his resurrection. What is it then that we believe? See, for me, I can't possibly believe that this idea of the resurrection and our resurrection from the dead, which is talking about an end time, is limited just to an end time. I can't believe that, because there's too much about just the meaningfulness of that experience of resurrection that should be overflowing into who and what you and I are today. There should be no separation between what will happen to us all later and where we are now as people, individuals in relationship with God. The other thing that's really intriguing is that because of the resurrection, what is the lineage that is handed down to us? What name do you and I each bear? And Jesus talks about it. What is it? Sons and daughters of God. We have a new identity. We have a new person because of Jesus. But I don't know whether or not you and I actually consider or believe enough or have dared ourselves to ask the questions. Notice when the Sadducees go up to Jesus and they rattle all this off, he doesn't say it's a bad question. He doesn't say that. He doesn't say you're not allowed to ask the question. He doesn't push back. He doesn't in any way, shape, or form tell them that this is inappropriate, you shouldn't be talking about this. He understands exactly that even though these Sadducees are doing it for political and religious reasons, that ultimately generation after generation after generation to us here today, we're going to ask the question, is there truly life after death? Is there truly this God who loves us so much that creates us, sends us into this world, not to suffer, not to struggle, not to, that's all part of life, but ultimately that we are meant to experience the beauty and the joy of this world, and that ultimately, because it's just the way we're designed, this doesn't last much more than 120 years, and that's it. There's a purpose, there is a design in how we are created. And ultimately, death comes to us all. And so the question is very appropriate. And for us as Christians, we believe that Jesus is the fulfillment, the answer to that question. And that is not always easy, and I don't think Jesus thought it would be, but ultimately that's why we gather as a community. That's why we gather when we gather. Not church for the sake of church. Not church because it's a law or regulation or whatever you want to call it. That's not the purpose. The purpose of gathering on a Sunday is to remind ourselves that you and I, each and every one, we all have these questions. And we all have faith that wanes from time to time. But we come together because together we realize I'm not the only crazy person who believes this. That there are others who believe and feel the same. And when our faith is weak and we don't know how to answer the question about the resurrection, we look around and we realize that other people are here too, and that we struggle together. But Jesus' point is very clear, and he is worthy to be trustworthy. 2 or more gathered in my name. 2 or more. And I am there in their midst. And so the Lord of the resurrection is here, is with us. We sometimes have to do the work to tune him in, to allow ourselves to ask the hard questions and to be okay with it. It doesn't make us bad people. It makes us human. And then to trust that by Jesus' Spirit, we are led through life, and ultimately in the end, because Jesus has said so, you and I experience resurrected life. God bless you.